I'm from Safe Space One, and I'd like to talk to you today about anonymity in the context of online services, and essentially any use of that term in an online service provision or a website or anything else is frankly bogus and needs to be halted because it communicates to the clients, the patients, something that fundamentally is not true. And we need to communicate that to practitioners and to those developers that don't get it, so that we can move to a world where what we communicate to patients is far more truthful and open and transparent. So I'm going to take you through the anonymity myths in online space, talk about end-to-end encryption and how it's very useful and very good, but actually has some limits that you need to understand. I'm going to touch on some legal frameworks just to highlight a couple of really important aspects of that. Really don't have time to go into detail. And then just finish off with talking about a trust model that says, okay, we can't be perfect, but we can get damn close. And let's understand how we achieve that. So let's talk about anonymity in general, and particularly in the context of personal data. This is the first place that most people talk about anonymity. It's about a computer system that's collected a lot of data about me, and perhaps that wants to be shared with others for the purposes of research or whatever other thing. The thing about the word anonymity in this context is that it just isn't really true. Truly anonymous data has no value left in its content. In other words, it's removed from being information to just data points with no informational value. So as you move data along the bottom axis there to have more informational content, you're increasing the risk that it will be re-identified because of the nature of the content. And if you look at the protections that you build around the data, they are limiting your ability to process the data, generally speaking. So you end up in the top left corner there with information that's of limited value, highly protected, but really you can't do much with it. So bad decisions and bad science. Where you really want to be is the top right corner, the ideal situation where you have maximum amount of protection and maximum access to information. That's a nirvana that does not exist. So somewhere there is a trade-off, and it's understanding that this is a trade-off is the really important point about data anonymity, is that as we increase protection, we reduce utility, and as we reduce informational value, we improve privacy, and somewhere there's a point in the middle there where we get to what we want to be able to do in terms of good decision making while balancing that with appropriate privacy protection. So in reality, the data is never, ever anonymized. The Americans like to call it, under the HIPAA regulation, it's de-identified. In other words, we've removed identifying traits of the data set in order to limit the likelihood that it can be re-identified. And that's really the world of big data and anonymity that people really need to fundamentally understand. It just isn't possible to be anonymous. It is possible to build out a trade-off. We can't get to the ideal situation, and we need to understand that there is always a risk in anonymized data, if that's the right word, what I would prefer to call de-identified data, that it can be re-identified and the associated informational value re-associated with you and therefore being disclosed. I'd also like to touch on the fundamentals of the internet itself. Back in my dim and distant past as a postgraduate student, I actually wrote a bit of the internet, so I have a fundamental understanding of the lower level protocols because I implemented some of them. And everything is addressable on the internet. This is a really fundamental thing to understand. And in order for me to be able to communicate to you, there has to be a unique address for me and a unique address for somebody else so that the informational content can be routed between us. Historically, this has mostly been done utilizing a basic standard called IPv4, Internet Protocol version 4, and it's now being updated to IPv6, which is not fully tested in the context of privacy protections, but certainly has had a lot of attention paid to it to try and improve its protections. The point is that most of your communication currently is still under IPv4. And that basically means that It's very easy for me to get the address of a group of people that are in roughly the same area. So your geographic location is very easy to identify. It would be something like your local town or village or something like that. IPv6 perversely sounds worse in as much that the connection between you and me is literally a unique address. It's a much longer number and a much longer address, and it makes it unique. So to protect that uniqueness and to provide you some degree of protection, the guidance is that address should be changed every 24 hours or so. However, looking into how that address is managed and what group of addresses it's selected from, is that every service provider will only have a limited number, a very large but limited number of addresses. So it's entirely possible that some contextual analysis in some future date could re-identify some information. There's not been a true re-identification mathematical assessment done on that model, as far as I'm aware. And ultimately, if you want to talk to a service provider like a website or a service provision, you need a domain name server, and who is managing the domain name service and who is providing that connectivity between your address and the service address, and are they collecting information, are they logging and the routing activities that are going on, and so on and so forth throughout the internet. There's a lot of people collecting little tidbits of information in order for them to provide the service to you, but in the aggregate is frankly identifying at some level. And that's kind of what most of the big marketing companies are trying to do, is understand how the internet works, how to put little tidbits of information around the internet, then when they aggregate them together, allow them to identify who you are and build a profile around you. So it's really the metadata, the metadata being the data about the data. So the data I'm sending to you is the data, when I send it, how I sent it, how often I send it, who else is involved in the communication. All of these things are the metadata, and can include very precise location information. As I exposed back in 2016, most of the service providers in the UK at that time, all by one, were collecting your location data and quote-unquote anonymizing it, which is provably not possible, and selling that on to third parties, so making literally hundreds of millions of pounds out of that. So the reality is the internet works it needs its addressability. It's thus fundamentally impossible to be truly anonymous between any two communicating entities on the internet. You can mitigate, you cannot absolutely protect. So let's look at the main tool we use for browsing the internet, and does it help or assist, and or is it a hindrance? And frankly, it's a problem when you're using a browser. There's a number of things that we know about. So, for example, cookies. Cookies are a means by which I can tag you and what you're doing on your on a website, and collate that information for the purposes of determining information around you and building a profile of you. They are used for other purposes, very legitimate, but they are also used for that marketing purpose, which is, from a marketing point of view, legitimate, but when utilised for purposes other than that particular purpose, or when hacked for other purposes, then they're very much not appropriate. So the other thing that more people are not aware of is fingerprinting. So this is how which browser you use, which computer you're on, which other add-ins to that browser you currently have, what is the power of your battery power of your PC at this point in time, or is it using something else? A whole load of information is accessible on a browser so that people can do the smart things that they do, but it's being perverted for use to fingerprint your browser as a unique browser. Now, some browsers are really working hard to try and mitigate this issue. So for people like Firefox are working hard on this, for example, and so is a number of others like Brave and people like that. But it's very, very difficult to absolutely inhibit. So you've got to understand what the techniques are to truly understand how to avoid them. And then there's your ISP. It really surprises me, but a number of people that don't actually check the T's and C's of their service provider, and particularly if they're American, which many of them are, because frankly, everything you do and everything you say is going through them, and if they log it, which many of them do, They could be utilizing it for purposes other than that for which you'd be comfortable with, particularly if you're providing a mental health service provision. So be really careful about your ISP or your cloud service provider. Truly understand what their T's and C's are and the degree of control over the metadata that they can collect, as well as some of the actual data if it's not encrypted. Be really careful. And then finally, there's the browser login. Firefox has it, Chrome has it. Firefox is pretty good in their controls to ensure that it's really a service provision and not a means of collating and profiling you, largely. Whereas, unfortunately, things like Chrome, fit into the Chrome business or the Google business model, which is contributory to that understanding. And by agreeing to their terms, you are potentially, unless you take explicit controls, agreeing to additional information exchange and sharing for purposes that you may not understand. So when you have clients utilizing a browser-based service or patients using a service, you need to be thinking about, are they logged in, and what information is being collated in that environment, and can perhaps you assist them in not logging in. End-to-end encryption, often touted as the be-all and end-all, the sort of the gold standard for achieving protection of people, and largely it is. And so it's essentially a means by which everything that goes on my computer in order for me to talk to you is encrypted in such a way that only you can understand it. So in a peer-to-peer world, literally your computer and my computer talk directly to one another. Everything is encrypted between the two by sharing their public and private keys in a key exchange mechanism. And we are really secure, which is why a lot of platforms use those. However, in a video conferencing platform, in particular, that can be problematic because you need a lot of processing power on your PC to service multiple users, and that's why the peer-to-peer mechanism is limited to one-to-one, or perhaps one to a few, 2 or 3, maybe 4. So many service providers then are differentiating their video conferencing and services like that by having a cloud-based service. But now you have a much more complicated key management need, so that essentially the cloud-based service which your service provider is using is managing those keys and sending them around, but at no point ever has access to the information that allows them to unlock any of the content. So even an employee of our company would not be able to decrypt the content. So the video stream and everything you say and do within it, for example, is completely and utterly confidential between the two communicating entities. So that sounds great, right? Which it is, ignoring the metadata information I talked about internet connectivity a minute ago. So is that the end of the game? Well, not really. Many of these service providers then ask you to either run in a web page or a application, an app that you have to download in order for them to do some of the fancy things they do, like, for example, augmented reality. And if you have an end-to-end encrypted environment, you cannot process the content of the video in the cloud because you just don't have access to it. So you have to process it on the client device with the associated processing limitations. But the benefit of that is that nobody else can see the content. But if you're running software from the cloud service provider, how do you know that that platform software now running on your computer is only doing augmented reality and that it's not doing something else? What's the controls and protections around that? Some interesting questions come out of that when you truly understand how end-to-end encryption works. So touching on GDPR and HIPAA, bear in mind, GDPR is focused on data protection, not privacy. They regulate the protection of your data. They don't regulate the privacy of it, although that is a consequential result in most cases. The e-privacy regulation is better for that. Interestingly, there is no legal reference to anonymity anywhere in the legal text. There is some guidance around trying to achieve anonymity, but it recognizes, the law recognizes that anonymity effectively cannot be achieved. It's not an absolute. It does refer to pseudonymity in the legal text, but that's largely a security technique by which you separate identifying information from the associated data content around a person, so that you can process the content independent of the identity and only reassociate at appropriate time. So in effect, you put them in two different places, making it harder for a hacker to be able to determine from the core data what the identity of the person was. Not impossible, just harder. Whereas HIPAA, which stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is kind of interesting, is very much more a commercial set of regulations, and works within the context of American law, which is a very different construct to European law. And indeed, just like GDPR, has no legal reference to anonymity. In fact, explicitly states in some of the guidance document that there is no such thing, as I previously intimated. It does demand, and this is what I think is really powerful and really interesting and should absolutely be probably one of the key takeaways that I'd like to see the regulatory frameworks move here in Europe for, is it does demand a percentage re-identification risk for aggregate data sharing. In other words, if I say I've de-identified the data, what is the risk that if I was to associate that now de-identified data with other data sets because it's been released into the wild, it's been hacked or whatever, of the content of that being reconnected back to the identity of the individuals it refers to. And that is mathematically computable. And the demand inside the HIPAA is that for certain types of data, that is what happens. And I think that's a really powerful thing. The other thing that both demand, and we actually kind of start here as a sort of point of principle ourselves, is that data minimization is really important. Data minimization means don't take anything you don't need, don't process anything you don't need, don't keep it any longer than you need, and don't share it or move it around the internet if you don't need to. So data minimization encapsulates all of those things, and the less you have and the less you move it and the less time you keep it for, the less risk there is to an individual. And it all adds up to how you are designing and building a platform to be fundamentally safe for mental health provision. So that's just one building block of a much wider set of building blocks we built into our trust model for mental health service provision. I hope you found this useful, and if you have any questions around anonymity and how to achieve it, you can't, but how to get close to it, you can. Let me know. I'd be more than happy to talk to you. Email me at buildingtrust@safespace1.com. Thank you. Bye-bye.